Hello and welcome to Celebrate Southern Africa. My name is Dawn Denton, and today I'm speaking to Mandy Whyman. Now, Mandy and I have a history that goes back to the 1980s, and yet, you kind of know when people have crossed paths, but it's really tricky to kind of remember how we cross paths and if we remember each other from school, because of course there were lots of people at school. So we were both, well, we were at a school where it was quite traditional. So there was a hierarchy and you didn't really mix with the juniors unless you had to. So, and we were too scared of the seniors. But it's so lovely to finally connect with you, Mandy. You are in Shropshire now and you've lived in other parts of the UK. Where else have you been?
When we first came over, we lived in Ruislip, which is North London, and then we moved to Essex, where we spent most of our time, but we've been in and out of the country. We've been to Oman and Mozambique too, and then came back to Essex and recently moved to Shropshire. Yeah.
That's a lovely way to kind of develop an experience for your creativity, because I'm sure you draw on those experiences when you create and write. Is that the case?
Yeah, I think it is. You use every time you write, and you'll know this because you're a writer, a little bit of yourself goes in. So a little bit of what you've seen, what you've experienced. And I found it very much, particularly in Essex, where we lived, the last place that we lived. We lived in a little village called Matching Tye that was really, really tiny, surrounded by fields. And you would go for walks down the fields and the stories would literally pop into your head, So yeah, so it does help a lot to be in different places.
I think you have to be aware of those stories popping into your head too, because a lot of people might walk through the field and not notice it the way a writer notices it.
Yeah, quite possibly. Maybe we were always on the lookout for a plot.
Some scheming plot. So you started your writing career as a journalist. How did that happen?
Well, I finished university and then I went overseas and I came back. I was with my then boyfriend, who's now my husband, and we came back and I had this BA in English and I didn't have anything to do. Nobody wanted a BA in English with no experience. And I saw an opening at the Germiston City News. And so I applied and was taken on as a reporter. And then I sort of hopscotched along. I had other jobs in between. And then I did a long stint at the Zululand Observer, which was probably the pinnacle of my journalistic career.
That's amazing. So as a journalist, I mean, do you just I suppose nowadays you could trawl, the internet and kind of find people that you can connect with or go and speak to. But how would you have done that in the old days?
Well, I mean, in the old days, you would literally go and find the person. You would, if something happened, you would literally go and find the person or find the person who had seen the person. And you spend a lot of your time traveling around. In fact, when my eldest daughter was little, I was following a story and forgot to pick her up from school because I just kept going.
That would have been quite an exciting thing to do.
It was tremendously exciting. I did love it. But of course, being a journalist in South Africa is not only high excitement, it's high pressure and it's high emotion. And I think there's, unless you've got a certain sort of steely personality, I think there's quite a high burnout rate. Because, of course, you do see you see some wonderful stuff, but you see some terrible stuff too.
Yeah, I'm sure you would have done that. But what kind of areas did you focus on then in journalism? Was it kind of the crazy stories, the big stories, or something that you went to seek out that was different and unusual?
Once you're in with the newspaper, because news moves so fast. So my typical beats when I was with the Zululand Observer is I was the emergency service, I was crime, and I was court. So as something came in, you would go and cover it. I met wonderful people who worked with the emergency services, and they were absolutely amazing. I used to go out with the fire brigade and the police and that sort of thing, and that was wonderful. But then, of course, going to court, you would then sit in court and you would see some some awful cases. And then some days it would be really quiet and you'd be wondering how you were going to fill those newspaper columns, and you would literally kind of go for a walk and see what you could find, you know. So I remember once in Richards Bay, it was a very quiet day, and going down to the harbour and seeing a bloom of jellyfish, and suddenly there was a story, you know. It was photos of the jellyfish. What sort of jellyfish were they? Did they come every year? And so on. So that was that kind of looking for stories all the time, really.
That's wonderful. Now, did you feel that journalism kind of gave you an opportunity to write creatively, or do you feel that the style and chasing the facts kind of puts us like a dampener on being as creative as you possibly can?
I think in many ways it does allow a certain creativity, and that's not in making it up. It's in taking somebody's story and making it achieve the aim that it needs to achieve. So if you've covered something that's quite tragic, you know, although you're reporting the facts, a lot of it's about word choice and about what you kind of include and how much of something you include in order to create a certain effect. So it's not changing the facts, but it is a well-written news story actually is a really crafted piece. You know, it's not, it does tell you the facts, but it also to some extent tells you the emotion behind the facts.
And that's what makes the story the story.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what made you then, you know, one of the things that I think struck me on your website is not until we are lost do we begin to understand ourselves, by Thoreau. And I kind of wonder if creativity comes out of being lost always, or if it is something that we can kind of grasp at any time.
I think there are many different types of creativity. I don't think creativity is a one single thing. There certainly is a depth of creativity that comes out of that feeling of being lost and needing to fill something. You know, that's a definite sort of creativity. But equally, there can be creativity and happiness, you know. So there are different types of creativity. We tend to give a lot of credence, I think, to creativity that is very powerful, very deep, and very emotional, that comes out of those crisis situations. And quite often, that is the wonderful writing and the wonderful song and the wonderful poem. But there's a lot to be said about the stuff that's also simple and happy, you know. So
I mean, I love a couple of the poems that you had in your, well, I love them all in Field Song, but one of the ones that really struck me was the tree where the dog was buried.
Yeah.
Because I'm completely in love with my dog, and I know I have to prepare for the day when she's not here. And I was very touched by that. So it's, I suppose, kind of locking into others having a similar experience, possibly, or have had one, that is kind of the direction that you would share your poetry, or the goal of the poetry. Would that be right? Or
yeah, I think there's a lot to that. I mean, we all share a human experience. We all love and hate and feel insecure and, you know, feel lost, feel found, and all those things. So quite often tapping into your own experience by its very nature, because we're human, taps into somebody else's experience. And one thing I always feel about writing is, as a writer, you're only doing sort of not even half the job. You put down the words, and the writing only lives when somebody reads it.
I
so
love that.
It only then becomes. And so that interpretation, that connection is actually what makes writing work. It's got something to do with the writer, but a lot of it has got to do with the way it is received and the way it is taken.
Wow. Yeah, I've never really thought about that, because I suppose a lot of people write for themselves at the beginning, and it's just for me, and I'm just going to put it on the shelf, and then people encourage them, share it, let's get the world to see it. And the next thing you're publishing, and you're like, whoa, I never expected that, because it was just for me to kind of express how I feel, or to come through a situation or to deal with something. So I think it's quite an interesting route with poetry, because it is for you, but it becomes. So do you now write only for you, or do you kind of write thinking maybe this can help somebody else think something or feel something?
I don't think you can think about it too much, because then it becomes insincere.
Yeah.
So you do write what you feel or what you experience, but that isn't the be all and end all. There's got to be some sort of awareness that it's going to be received at the other end. So that's where the crafting then comes in, and the fine tuning, when you're making sure that it's going to be received in the way that you want it to be received. And of course, there's never any guarantee, but yeah.
But now, when you teach poetry as well, is that right?
I'm no longer a full-time teacher, but I teach tutor children. So yeah, I teach the set texts.
And that, so how do you help someone unleash? Because a lot of us will say, oh, I'm not really very creative, and I don't really, but I know that as human beings we are naturally creative. That is who we are and how we exist in the world. But how do you encourage somebody to see the world creatively when they have that viewpoint of, do you know what, I'm not really very creative, I'm more mathematical, or I'm more whatever?
It very much depends on the individual. I do have students sometimes who are very, very sort of logical, very practical, and can't see the metaphor for the wood, So in that case, it's really about people's associations. So quite often it's boys who tend to battle with poetry, So you'd say to them, football, what does football mean? And they'll go, it's a game, it's fun, and all the rest. And then you extend from that. How does it make you feel? Why does it make you feel that? And that's how you get along, because at the root of all poetry is emotion. And so once you can tap into the emotion, once you can find your way into the emotion, you can find the poetry.
Did you always enjoy poetry, like at school, or was it something that kind of evolved as you explored different writing avenues?
Oh, I always adored it. My grandmother had it on her shelf, and this is years and years ago. I must have been 7 or 8. My grandmother had huge shelves of books, and she had Debrett's Book of Elocution, and it was this fat book of elocution, and I went through it, and it was what these old books, I don't know if you've ever seen an old book of elocution.
No.
They've got passages and poems in them that people would then say aloud and practice their diction and their elocution. And I came across the poem Invictus, and I was absolutely hooked, and that was it. And I was really young, but that kind of astonishing understanding that this poem had survived so many years and still had an impact, still had this tremendous impact. And then, of course, it just grew and grew and grew. My grandmother loved Shakespeare, and so I loved Shakespeare, and that kind of weaving with words I just adored. And then, of course, in South Africa during the struggle, and you had those unbelievable kind of protest poets, and that power of the word, and how the word can just fly over everything else. That just, poetry just became a thing.
Oh, it's wonderful. Do you think, though, that having written a lot of poetry, you read poetry differently?
I don't know, but poetry is different. When you read prose, when you read a novel, quite often you read a novel and you think, oh, I've read this story before, and it's not, it doesn't work. Poetry is slightly different because again, it's so emotionally based. So you do, I suppose, become a little bit critical, but quite often you're going, wow, I never saw it that way, or wow, that's a good word. So I think poetry is slightly different to prose. And yeah, I mean, there's good and bad, but I think it's easier to find something new.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point, actually, because just a different combination of words will have a completely different meaning, which makes a lot of sense. Do you find your inspiration Like, do you just write poems and then just collect them together into a theme and say, okay, these sit nicely into a publication? Or do you sit down and think, okay, I'm going to write a series of poems in a certain theme?
I think it's a bit of both. So what happens is there tends to be a creative outpouring. I was going to say a creative vomit, but that doesn't sound very nice.
Well, it's actually very creative, yes.
So there tends to be, you know, something will strike you and you'll think, oh, yeah, I'll write about that. And then at some point, you would have a look at the stuff that you scribbled in your notebooks. Now, I don't know about you, but I've got notebooks everywhere. And you'll start looking through the notebooks and you go, oh, yeah, spot a theme, in which case you start collecting. And once you've got sort of the heart of a collection, then I would tend to kind of write more on the collection, but they're always ones that have to be discarded and ones that you're going to save for later and so on. So yeah, it's a bit of both.
You must have loads and loads of poems, that you could at any time just pull together and put into an anthology of sorts. Or,
well, I've got loads and loads of bits of poems. The inspiration strikes, and you get 3 or 4 stanzas and you can't quite finish it, and so you put it away for another day. So I've got lots like that. Not so many in terms of completed poems, but I'm getting there with a anthology, with a collection at the moment, and I'm hoping to have that sort of done fairly soon, before Christmas, I'm hoping.
Yeah, well, it's really tricky when you kind of have to dig for the inspiration too. And then also as a creative, all the other stuff about, you know, formatting and all of that, it seems quite frustrating, because that's the part that is that the part you quite like, or do you prefer just the poetry bits?
Well, I think there's a lot of tools at the moment that are quite good. And once you've kind of, I think when I think back to when I first started self-publishing, the first one I did was, I look at it now and I think,
but it was great at the time. You were like, wow.
Yeah, whereas at the time you're like, oh, I made a book. But now you're looking and going, oh, that's not so good. But yeah, I think once you sort of cracked it, it becomes easier and easier, and there's so many good platforms now that can help. You know, I think a lot of people self-publish on Kindle, but actually drop to digital is so easy. You know, you don't need any skill whatsoever. So yeah.
Now, you've also written a few how-to books. Is that a completely different, because now you have to think process of how you would go about something, or how you could encourage others to go about something, and that must be a complete shift in your head, in your writing.
In a way, yeah, it was, but it's just a different box, really. And the how-to guides, I wrote as soon as I'd stopped teaching, and it was born out of frustration, really. You know, all my students would come with these guides, and you think, oh, goodness sake, it's not, you know, they're so prescriptive, and they're not telling them how to kind of get their own ideas. And so those guides that I did were sort of born out of that frustration. And I needed to get them out my system. So
I love that, because it's just kind of, I spoke to a teacher who said when they were at school, they would watch the teacher and say, I can teach this better, and so they became a teacher and did teach it better. So it's a bit like that. So are you going to do more how-to guides, or at the moment are you just focusing on your poetry?
Yeah, no, I think I'm done with that. I think I'm done with the how-to guides. It's a very competitive field too, and you know, it's once they were out of my system, I don't really feel any need to revisit them or anything like that. And I think that's a lot. Sometimes that's the way it is with writing, is, you know, you've got something that hammers at you, and then you spit it all out, and then you're like, oh, okay, that's done.
Done. Yeah, I can move on to the next thing.
Yeah.
So do you call yourself a poet, or what do you call yourself?
It's always a crisis, isn't it? Because at what point do you become a writer? Do you become a writer when you write, or do you become a writer when you sell your writing, or do you become a writer when you make an independent living out of your out of your writing? And is it just a little bit cringy to call yourself a writer? So I don't know. In my boldest moments, I say I'm a writer, but in my less bold moments, I write on the side. So.
Yeah, and then there's the difference. So what would be the difference between author and writer? Because some people call themselves author. And is that when you published, or?
I don't know. I think it's one of those tricky things too. It has a lot to do with kind of the way that you see yourself and your levels of imposter syndrome. I suppose if you feel established, you would call yourself an author. And I don't know what the levels of security are which require you to be called an author.
I kind of think author is maybe creative.
Far away from author.
I kind of think author is more like a novelist. I get, whereas writer in my head feels like, oh, I write articles and I do some nonfiction and I do a bit of creative writing. Yeah. It feels like it's a bit more encompassing. Whereas I think author might be, I don't know, some kind of fictional novel. It feels in my, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm moving that way because the latest thing I've written is this novella, Like Water, and I'm working on another novel now. But I don't know what it is about the word author. It just sounds a bit kind of bow tie, doesn't it? It sounds a bit. You just feel like maybe that's too aspirational to say I'm an author. I'm just a writer, and occasionally I turn out a novel.
And like you say, there's an introvertism with writers because it's such an isolating, lonely kind of job unless you're collaborating. But even then, you still have to do your own bit on your own. So maybe the personality of people who do write, it's not really a kind of a show-offy kind of thing. It's more just it's just the act of writing, and that's what I'm happy with. That's who I am. So I suppose I can see it in both ways.
I think, I mean, to a certain extent, maybe you've got to own it before you can be it. But I don't know that I feel that I feel like I own it enough at the moment to be it. So I prefer to call myself a writer, I suppose.
Now, writing a novella is completely different because you've got to have the plot, you've got to have some kind of friction, you've got all the kind of the processes of writing. And what is the definition then of a novella as opposed to a novel?
A novella is just shorter. So I think there is a technical. I think anything under 30,000 words is a novella, and then a 30 and above is a novel.
And is this a young adults, or is it a?
It's a young adult. Yeah, it's a young adult novella.
How do you choose?
Sorry.
How do you choose it? Young adult or adult?
I didn't choose. Again, it was just happened. The story was sitting there, and the story was in my head, and the story when it came out was a young adult story. So it wasn't necessarily a choice. It just sort of happened, and I think that's the way it quite often happens with stories, is that they appear, and when they appear and the characters appear and the plot appears, it slots into some sort of brackets that you maybe didn't intend it to be, but there it is.
That's amazing, because you start out with a blank document, and when you end, it's a completely different journey to what you expected.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, with Like Water, it was one of those where I wrote it, and I took forever to write the first draft. And when I looked at the first draft, I didn't like it. So I kept some bits and did the whole thing again. And then it worked because it hadn't gelled the first time round. It didn't come out the way I wanted it to. But I believe that's a common problem, is that people have to rewrite lots.
Yeah. And I think that's the part that the writers hate the most is oh, I'm kind of bored with it now. I've written it, I've edited, I've gone through it, and now I have to do it again and again and again. I think that's where in the editing process, it's the gap between the creativity and the publishing that takes longer in a way, because it's such a drag to do.
Well, yeah, it's because the first bit is all the creative bit, isn't it? And that just flows and it feels lovely and all the rest. And then you've got to go back and check your spelling and check that your characters are the same throughout and so on. And that's a bit pedantic and it is a bit boring. But I think there's a certain satisfaction in it too, isn't it? Just making sure that all the bits fit.
Yeah, which is why I've kind of avoided the novel writing, because I think that's an incredible skill that I just think few people have, because I just think it's incredible skill. So I've kind of steered away from that. So Mandy, tell us a little bit about Like Water and where we can find it, and also where your other books are available.
Okay, so Like Water is based on the story of Mercutio and Romeo from Romeo and Juliet, but it's in a modern setting. And now this brings us to Hags, to Potch Girls High, is when we were in Potch Girls High. And so this is how long the story has been brewing. Mrs. Ackerman, who was our English teacher, taught us Romeo and Juliet. And we talked about the relationship between Romeo and Mercutio, and why Mercutio would give up his life for the honor of his friend. And this has sat in my brain and sat in my brain and sat in my brain. And of course, when we were at school, it was illegal to be gay in South Africa. So that kind of idea sort of brewed and brewed and brewed and brewed about the idea of Mercutio loving Romeo and Romeo not realizing Mercutio loved Romeo, and Mercutio sort of falling on his own sword. Of course, in Like Water, Mercutio doesn't die, but it's that same sort of friction going on in Mercutio being the person that needs to be loved, but isn't because they can't reveal themselves, really.
And how did that conversation unfold itself in Mrs. Ackerman's class?
Well, I mean, if you remember Girls' Highs, the teachers were always quite daring, weren't they? Yeah. They were politically aware at a time when we were all supposed to be politically silent. They were human aware at a time when we were supposed to be all humanly silent. And so the conversation really kind of unfolded in the way of Mercutio cared for Romeo. And I don't think it was ever sort of said, but it was implied in the conversation that there was more to it than a friend, because you don't do that for a friend, you do that for somebody you love. And I think that was sort of the follow-on, really. And so this, that idea, that kernel of an idea has always sat there. And I think there were little things along the way that sort of molded Mercutio and made Mercutio come alive. When I was first courting my husband, we went down to Cape Town and we were sitting in a restaurant, and there was a male couple there, and they looked like a couple. And one desperately looked like he wanted to touch the other one, but couldn't. And it's those little things that have sort of all kind of accumulated, and they made the story of Romeo and Mercutio, and this kind of idea of Mercutio never being able to get what he wanted and Romeo being blissfully unaware.
Oh, Mandy, that's such a sad kind of way of looking at it. And you realize that just for us, just having that conversation was not really allowed, and we had to imply it. And then there were people who were living it, which would have been an incredible trauma.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that that makes stories like Romeo and Juliet timeless, isn't it? Because we see those little kernels of humanity in those characters. And, and I think that's what makes a good story, is when we see something of humanity in what we read.
Wow. So Like Water, where can people find it?
Like Water can actually be bought at Waterstones. Haha.
That's amazing. How do you get into Waterstones? That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's published through Ingram Sparks, so it's available through Barnes and Noble. So it's then available through Waterstones. It's also available through Apple Play. It's available on Kindle. It's available on Amazon.
So it kind of tackles a theme that is, like you say, a bit timeless, but also born out of a struggle and a difficult time when people can't necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thinking behind it. Like Water is set in modern day London, so it's gay is not taboo, but the circumstances that the boys find themselves in make the whole kind of relationship not a possibility. So it's told in a series of first person, a bit like William Faulkner's writing, where you've got the different characters who tell their story. And so we've got a bit of how Mercutio sees things, a bit how Romeo sees things, and then there's this plot going on behind it, how they all get sort of drawn together into a sort of gangland disaster.
Wow. Oh, that sounds very exciting. So Mandy, what are you reading at the moment?
What am I reading? I have just finished Purple Hibiscus by, I want to go Chimamanda, but it's not. It's Chimamanda, isn't it? And I can never remember the second name, but it's fantastic. Purple Hibiscus.
How do you choose your books to read? What do you just kind of look at what other people are reading and recommend?
Actually, a lot of recommendations put me off. I don't like to read what everybody else is reading. That tends to put me off a little bit.
That's why I never read Harry Potter.
I never read Harry Potter either. And there's other authors, and no offense to them, I'm sure they're wonderful, but Jodi Picoult I could never read because everybody's going, oh, she's so wonderful. I was like, no, I can't possibly read that. So I tend to stumble across authors that I like. Joe Lansdale. Have you ever read Joe Lansdale? He's an American author who wrote the Hap and Lenny series. But he's actually written, he writes sort of really almost surrealistic, because I'm not a crime fan, but they're surrealistic crime novels that are set in like the deep south of America. And they are just astonishingly good. So I like that. And then one of my favorite authors is a guy called Tim Winton. Ever heard of Tim Winton?
No.
It's an Australian writer, also sort of slightly surrealistic and absolutely amazing. A master of the short story. If I can give you any recommendation, Tim Winton's Dirt Music is absolutely amazing.
Wow. Oh, I love it. I'm so excited for your next one. What's the next one?
The next one is, I've got a collection of poetry that I'm hoping to have sort of ready and done pretty soon. And then I've got another novel in the works, which would be an adult novel, which again is Shakespeare inspired. How good's your Shakespeare, Dawn?
Not great. We did Dickens by the time we got to matric. So
oh, did you? Well, this is based on it's like a completely fictional idea, but again, it was something that's been sitting in my head for ages and ages and ages, is this idea of Sycorax, who is the mother of Caliban on the island in The Tempest. Okay, so does that ring any bells?
Yes, yes.
So Caliban is sort of this monster creature that lives on the island, and he always says, this island is mine by Sycorax, my mother. And they talk about Sycorax as the hag from Algiers, as a witch who had landed up on the island, and then of course was mean to Ariel and imprisoned him in a tree and all sorts of things. Anyway, so this idea has been brewing about who Sycorax might be. And when I was in the Middle East, you talked about this earlier, about how you find stories and how they influence things. When I was in Oman, I learned that Oman had been the Republic of Oman and Zanzibar. And of course, Zanzibar was the heart of the East African slave trade. And the East African slave trade doesn't get the kind of attention that the West African slave trade did because fewer numbers moved through East Africa, but it went on for a longer time. In fact, there were still slaves being traded out of Zanzibar, very undercover, in the 1950s, believe it or not. But what made that trade also different was that the slaves being traded through Zanzibar were predominantly young men and women. They weren't men intended for the plantations or strong people as in the West African slave trade. They were intended for harems. They were intended to work in houses. They were intended to be eunuchs and so on. And so this all started coming together. I was like, where did Sycorax come from? Why did they think she was a witch? And so on and so on. And that's where that story is coming from. So it's a story of Sycorax.
That's wonderful, Mandy. I'm so excited for that. So people can find you also, they can connect with you on mandywhyman.com. And then, of course, they can find your books on Amazon, so they can do a little search there and they can find that. But Mandy, it's been so lovely to finally chat to you and also learn a little bit about your writing and your background, your journalistic background, and then coming into the modern times with your poetry and your novellas. But thank you so much for joining us. It's been lovely to chat.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dawn. Thanks so much for having me.